Welcome back. In the 2020 primary field, we're watching several possible presidential candidates on the Democratic side who have served or are currently members of the U.S. House. That includes the first Democrat to officially enter the race. Former Congressman John Delaney of Maryland has been to the Granite State more than a dozen times already and now has an office open here. While he's put a heavy focus on Iowa, he says New Hampshire is just as important to his strategy.
I've learned from the people of New Hampshire that a lot of them are struggling, right? Despite the fact that we see kind of this good economic data on a kind of a high level, on a macro level, what's kind of down in people's families and in their homes is not the same story we see when we see the stock market going up and things like that. I hear a lot about the opioid crisis that's obviously hitting this state particularly hard. I hear a lot of anxiety from families worrying, will their kids have a job here in New Hampshire? Or they're going to have to commute to Boston, or they're going to have to move out of this area. So I hear those kind of concerns that you expect people to have, things that are affecting their families, their children, opportunities for their kids. Will they be able to stay in their communities? What's happening with their job? They're worried about how technology and automation, we were just talking about that as it relates to this wonderful set we're sitting on, how technology is changing everything. They're worried, will this be disrupting their jobs? So there's a lot of anxiety out there. And they're obviously very concerned with the president.
Congressman Eric Swalwell of California is also considering a run for the White House and tells us in a sit-down interview he's getting closer to a decision. The fourth-term representative has been an outspoken critic of President Trump, particularly when it comes to accusations of Russian collusion in the 2016 election.
New Hampshire matters. It's always going to matter. And I don't think we can have a nominee that didn't do well in New Hampshire, because if you do well here, it's because you understand day-to-day kitchen table issues that people care about, and I think those issues are that promise of America, which is if I work hard, I do better, and I look at my kids, and I can dream bigger. For me, I feel connected to everyday folks. I'm the first in my family to go to college. My wife and I have 2 kids under 2. I've got just under $100,000 in student loan debt. So I'm for the issues people care about because I live them every day. And I see that if the promise of America can make it to your neighborhood where you work hard, do better, and dream bigger, that it can change your life. But I don't think it's making it to every neighborhood today, and I want to make sure it does. And that's why I'm even considering doing this.
Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard has officially declared her candidacy, and several more current representatives are also weighing their own runs. Gene Mackin introduces us to them.
Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is a combat veteran serving in Iraq and Kuwait with the Hawaiian National Guard. She is prioritizing foreign policy, particularly military strategies in the Middle East and the war on terror. But her 2016 meeting with Syrian President Bashar Assad raised many eyebrows, as does her previously strong opposition to same-sex marriage. On that issue, she says she has changed her position and says unity and service are the key to protecting American democracy.
When we raise our right hand and volunteer to serve, we set aside our own interests to serve our country, to fight for all Americans.
Representative Seth Moulton of Massachusetts also has a military service record. He received the Bronze Star for his actions in the Battle of Najaf in Iraq back in 2004. He says he hasn't decided if he'll run and is downplaying talk of 2020, but he did recently visit New Hampshire and talked about one of the lessons he learned from the war.
What it feels like to be betrayed by our country, or at least betrayed by the leaders in Washington.
Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan is a frequent flyer to the Granite State, hosting fundraisers here.
This past spring, the 45-year-old met with Democrats before delivering the commencement address at his alma mater, the former Franklin Pierce Law School, now the University of New Hampshire School of Law.
One of the things we have to do is get people engaged.
And former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke lost his U.S. Senate race to incumbent Ted Cruz, but won some significant name recognition. The 46-year-old is now considering entering the presidential race and says he'll be traveling outside Texas to meet voters.
As we talked about earlier this hour, there are a number of U.S. senators likely to be running in 2020, but only one has the name recognition and a base of support significant enough to give him the title of frontrunner. 2016 New Hampshire primary winner Bernie Sanders hasn't made a definitive statement about what he's going to do, but his candidacy would reset the race in a big way. John DeStaso joins us now to help us unpack the biggest question of all right now, which is, will Bernie Sanders run for president in 2020?
I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question. I'm not even sure that Bernie Sanders does right now, but his supporters here, his core supporters, within the last week or so have started to get some signals that Bernie Sanders is very seriously considering it.
Is it safe to say, if he runs, that the pressure's on him, he has to win the New Hampshire primary?
I would say absolutely. I mean, he set the bar high. Of course, with a two-person race, 60% wasn't, you know, that's a two-person race. If he's in a 10 or 12 or more person race, you know, the winning percentage might be in the low to mid-20s. We'll have to see who's actually candidates come the time the primary rolls around. But given the fact that he is the one, I think he would have to win here. If he can't win in New Hampshire, his neighboring state, he will be going up against another neighbor, Elizabeth Warren. But at the same time, this is known now as Bernie country. At least it had been. We'll have to see now whether he can continue to, you know, solidify at least a good part of the following that he had. This is all if he decides to run. But yeah, I would say it's a must-win in New Hampshire. I don't think anyone can disagree with that.
New Hampshire has a deep well of political expertise, but how much does history matter in the current political climate? Campaign veterans with plenty of their own experience weigh in just ahead. And what about candidates with no political experience at all? We'll introduce you to some of the outsiders who are or could soon be running.
I think you just don't like being told what to do.
I'll never forget New Hampshire. I'm grateful to the people for what they've shared with me.
The greatest political experience of my life is right here in New Hampshire.